It was to be a sleepless night. I first paid the conductor for our upgraded ticket, which resulted in a higher price than that which I would normally pay, owing to the fact that I was upgrading after we had set foot aboard the train, and a considerable way into the journey. This left me seething, but that was not to be the reason I was to have a sleepless night. Anna's snobbery regarding the lower classes meant that she was now in a situation where she might be discovered by the revolutionaries. She had set my plans awry, and now I needed to compensate. I had to keep a watchful eye out for the revolutionaries, for if they were to strike, then they would strike in the dead of night, when we were most likely to be off our guard. Therefore, I absolutely could not sleep, as I had to act as the guardian angel, watching over Anna in her slumber. I lay awake on my bunk, listening, and once or twice I prowled out into the corridor to check if anyone were lurking, to see if anyone suspicious was searching the compartments for signs of the princess. In all, I found no one, nor saw any signs of any lurkers. But that wasn't to say I could let my guard down. I had to be alert at all times. The revolutionaries could have struck at any moment, and I had to be prepared to defend Anna at all costs, to give my life for hers if it came down to it. The previous day I had sent a telegraph to Cuffrey and ordered Belvedere, the butler, to greet us at Aber Station with 3 horses. At around 8:30 we arrived. Earlier, feeling grouchy from my lack of sleep, I awoke Anna and told her to once more dress in the steamer captain's clothes. Once this was done, with a deal of protestation, I escorted her back to 3rd class, where I found a compartment, empty, from where we could depart the train. Despite Anna being insistent on exposing herself to the revolutionaries, I could still take steps, such as this, in order to confound them. They would expect someone of her stature to leave from a 1st-class carriage, and so we would depart from a 3rd. If on the small chance they knew we were aboard, and in 1st class, then they might, with luck, assume we had not yet alighted. We were the only pair to leave at Aber Station, and so hurried away before any of the other passengers could take notice of us. The sun was shining that day, a blessed day as we call it in Wales, and although Belvedere had not yet arrived, it was a pleasure to wait for him. Anna wanted to wait on the seashore, and so we did just that. I pointed her towards the various sights that could be seen around Bay Conway. To the east, Pen y Gogarth, and to the west, Ynys Seriol, a teardrop on the end of Ynys Mon. Immediately across the water I picked out Beaumaris and the castle, to which Anna laughed. "You call that a castle? It is quaint and teensy. A true castle is big and imposing. A true castle is grand." I said nothing on the matter, hoping to surprise her once we reached Cuffrey. In due course Belvedere arrived, strolling down the road with 3 horses in tow, an open-necked shirt on his back, and a straw boater upon his head. He looked ridiculous. "You are the butler?" Anna questioned him right off. "I am indeed, and you must be Miss Anna." He bowed, ever so lightly and delicately. "I can tell that you are wondering why I am dressed in such a fashion. It is not my usual attire. I merely considered that it might serve to confound the revolutionaries, in a manner similar to your own dress." Ah, such was Belvedere. He was always considering, but never thinking, and as a result, he was usually getting things in a terrible muddle. This was not his absolute worst faux pas, not by a long chalk, but it was still off the tracks somewhat. "Belvedere," I told him, sounding exhausted, "you are extraordinarily well known in these parts. Dressed in that fashion, people will start talking and gossiping, wondering why you are wearing such a get-up. Now imagine if the revolutionaries got wind of that gossip. 'Why,' they will ask, 'is the butler to the most famous family hereabouts dressed in such a fashion?' They will start to think, and then they may perhaps come to the not-so-wild conclusion that the reason involves a certain princess." Belvedere looked agape as he realised his folly, and began to make profuse apologies. "Save it, Belvedere," I ordered. "What is done is done. We shall proceed to Cuffrey as planned." Belvedere held out one of the horses for Anna, a chestnut colt who was always friendly to strangers, and without a fiery temperament of any kind. She climbed onto his back with skill and dexterity, precisely as you would expect from one who has been riding horses all her life. I was then handed one of the remaining horses, my favourite. Like the other, he was a chestnut colt, but he could not have been more different in temperament from his fellow equine. I was the only person he was allowed to sit upon his back, and even then he showed signs of resenting it. My orders were obeyed with a slow, lingering hesitation, and more often than not I had to tell him twice before he would even begin to think about what I wanted him to do. Secretly, however, I think he enjoyed our rides together. His eyes would always light up as I saddled him, and his tail would begin to swish as that of a dog. His gait became visibly more jolly too, and his head always rose that little bit higher, as though he were proud to carry me. I loved that horse more than I have loved any before or since. No longer do I own any horse, owing to the advent of the motor car. But even if I did, no beast could replace that chestnut colt in my affections. The three of us aboard our steeds, Belvedere turned to me. "By which route shall we ride home, sir?" "Which way did you come from?" "Through the Aiguy Pass, sir, and then along the Roman road that runs beside the mountain of Lim." "Then we shall return by the more direct route, across the high plains. And perhaps, Miss Anna, you would like to see the magnificent Aber Falls along the way." "Yes, indeed, I would like that a great deal," she responded. And so we set off at a brisk trot, back towards the station, and then down the secluded, leafy lanes of Aber village that would eventually lead us to the falls. I hear rumour that once there was a palace here, belonging to the House of Aberfrau, though where it actually was I could not tell you for the life of me. It was also somewhere in these parts that Prince Dafydd, the last true Prince of Wales, was captured by the forces of Edward Longshanks, and so ended the last days of an independent Wales. By the way he was attempting to flee into the mountains, he was probably attempting to reach Cuffrey. Had he reached there, and not been captured on the slopes of Berrima, his fate would likely have been a similar one. My ancestors had played the war for both sides, on the sly, and as a result, they were allowed to keep all their lands and titles, unlike many other members of the Welsh aristocracy of the time. These facts I told to Anna as we passed through the village on our way to the falls. The part she seemed most interested in was the one concerning my ancestors being Welsh aristocracy. "So you are Lord Morferson, yes?" she beamed. "Not exactly. By the time the Glyndŵr rebellion happened in 1400, it was well known that my ancestors had played both sides. Glyndŵr, when he was crowned, stripped us of our titles as punishment. King Henry did the same, as well as confiscating our lands, in order to make sure that we wouldn't be able to side with Glyndŵr." "Who did your family side with?" "Both sides. We were split. Some supported Henry, others Glyndŵr. The ones who supported Glyndŵr were executed. Henry gave back the lands to the ones who had supported his cause as payment for loyalty. But not the titles, I'm afraid. After that we learned to steer well clear of internal political conflicts. By the time of the Civil War in the 17th century, we were just content to cash in. Us and the Blackaders. Those lands you talk of, you still retain them?" "Some. They are not so large as they once were. We retain the ancestral seat in the nearby village. That is about all." "Would your Queen Victoria give you a title?" "Not bloody likely. My father insulted the memory of her beloved Albert. It was not I who did it, and yet she still holds me to what my father did." "Then my father shall give you a title for protecting me. You shall be Lord Morferson of Ardaloota." "If it is all the same, Miss Anna, I would rather be paid with money than with a title." It was not long before we left the village, and were passing along the tree-lined avenue that led to the falls. We caught no glimpse of them until, in a moment, we rounded a small kink in the road, and there they were before us. They were just the same as they ever were, and just the same as they ever will be, thundering downwards in a long ribbon from the high plains, a great rush of water that pounds down a rugged cliff face, and returns to the earth with a sound so loud that one can barely hear oneself speak above it. Even from a fair distance I could therefore not ask Anna her opinions of the falls for this reason, although I saw that her face was a picture of indifference. "It is quaint," she would tell me later on, "much like that castle across the sea." When I told her that it was the largest natural waterfall in Wales, she laughed, and said that if that were the largest, then the others could hardly be considered waterfalls at all. We pressed on, having observed the falls, up into the mountains by way of a track that is used by tourists to reach the top. And there, after scaling a further small rise, we found ourselves on the high plains of the Carnevy Mountains, the craggy grey of Berrima looming before us, and the rounded knoll of Luitmore towering to our left. Our pace quickened, the wind almost blowing our hats from our heads, and we raced towards Berrima, rounding it to the right, so that we might eventually come to the peak of Berrabag, and then again turning left, so that we had rounded Berrima across 3 sides. As we reached Berrabag, we stopped and looked out towards Bethesda. The nearest mountain across the valley was blackened and cut open, belching ugly clouds of smoke into the sky. It looked like the entrance into hell. "Who would do such a terrible thing to this lovely landscape?" Anna asked me, horrified. "The Baron's Penrhyn," I sneered before turning my back to that heinous monstrosity. The sight was soon forgotten as we set our horses, now cantering southwards across the plain, towards Ir Arig and Garneth Uchaf. In places the ground was rough and rocky, and here we had to proceed slowly, but far more was open grassland, especially in the dips between the high knolls. In between Uchaf and Folgrak, Anna decided that she would throw caution to the wind, and as she rode, undid her bonnet from about her head, and allowed it to fly away to somewhere it might never be found. The look of ecstasy upon her face said more than words ever could. She was happy, glad to be alive, and have the wind in her face and the mountains about her. She came to a stop on the far side of Folgrak, seeing a group of wild ponies stampeding across the valley before her. Again, the look of joy upon her face said more than words ever could. "Mr. Max, you never told me that you had horses near to your home." "Aye, but they aren't the best part," I laughed. "Oh? And what is the best part? Follow me and I will show you." I began to trot away across the valley before breaking into a sprint, Anna coming close behind and Belvedere a distant third. I lost my hat as I hit the slopes of Llewellyn, but hang it, I had plenty more. The going became rocky here, so I had to slow a little, but not by much. I turned east before I reached the peak, heading downwards, and found myself on a sharp and narrow track. Then it was just around one more bend, and home was in sight. I stopped before it, as I knew Anna surely would when she rounded the bend behind me. True to form, this is precisely what occurred. She came to a halt in a clattering of hooves and whinnies, and nearly fell from her horse in astonishment. Father always said that the single best way to impress any woman, be she princess or commoner, was to show them cuffery. His words never rang truer than on that day, as Anna looked down, for the first time, in awestruck admiration, at the many-turreted, sweeping, and enormous castle before her. It took her breath away, and no wonder. No other castle in all the world comes as close to majesty and beauty as Cuffery does, even in a state so ruinous as I have always known it. Anna said but 4 words in all the time we stared at it. "I am in love."